He stood alone by a frozen lake at dawn, keeping a fire alive with shaking hands, because if the flames died, something in the dark would step closer. A bear had already circled his camp once, his dog hadn't slept all night, and Ethan Hawkwood, a war veteran who had survived louder nights than this, whispered to himself, "Stay awake. Just stay." He didn't come here to be brave. He came because silence was the only thing he hadn't faced. Then he found a boat that shouldn't exist, a journal that ended mid-sentence, and a truth that made him stop breathing. "I'm not the first," he said softly. Before we begin, please support the channel by subscribing. And tell me, how are you feeling right now, and where in the world are you watching from? I truly want to know how far this story can travel across the earth. The lake did not welcome him. It did not shimmer, did not ripple, did not offer the polite illusion of beauty. It lay there flat and gray under a sky still undecided about daylight, as if it had been holding its breath for years, and saw no reason to release it now. The air smelled of wet pine and cold stone, sharp enough to sting the inside of the nose. Somewhere far off, a bird tested the morning with a single call, then thought better of it and went quiet again. Ethan Hawkwood stopped the truck beside a line of old pines whose trunks were scarred and twisted, their bark split open by storms that had come and gone without witnesses. When he turned the engine off, the sudden absence of sound felt physical, like pressure against his ears. Metal clicked softly as the hood cooled. Then even that faded. Silence closed in, not empty. Not calm, but dense, layered, as though it carried weight of its own. He stayed in the driver's seat longer than necessary, hands resting on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the water through the windshield. The lake looked like a thought that had never been finished. Something paused mid-sentence and left that way out of exhaustion rather than choice. Ethan did not rush to open the door. He had learned, slowly and at great cost, that there were moments in life that fractured if approached too quickly. Better to let them come to you. Better to let them decide when they were ready. When he finally stepped out, the cold reached him immediately, sliding through the seams of his old brown leather jacket. The jacket creaked as he moved, stiff with age and weather, carrying the faint scent of smoke and oil that no amount of time ever fully erased. Beneath it, the faded green military t-shirt clung lightly to his frame, the fabric worn thin in places, as if it too had survived things it never spoke about. His jeans were bleached at the knees, softened by years of use, and his boots sank slightly into the damp ground with each step. Hunter jumped down from the passenger side without a sound. The German Shepherd was 6 years old now, large and solid, his dark brown and black coat thick along the spine and lighter at the chest. He moved with an economy of motion that came from instinct rather than training, every step deliberate, every pause meaningful. His ears stayed upright, swiveling gently as he took in the clearing, his tail low and still. He did not look at Ethan for direction. He did not need to. Ethan chose a spot close to the water where the ground sloped gently and the trees thinned just enough to let the lake breathe. He worked without hurry. Stakes pressed into damp soil with a dull resistance. Canvas unfurled, then tightened under hands that had once carried heavier burdens than any tent ever could. Each small action grounded him, tethered him to the present in a way words never had. Hunter circled once, then again, nose brushing the earth, memorizing scents the way some creatures memorize maps. The fog began to lift as the tent took shape. It did not rise all at once, but peeled itself from the surface of the lake in thin layers, revealing water that remained stubbornly still. Ethan finished securing the last line and stepped back, his breath visible now in short, quiet clouds. For a moment, he simply stood there, listening, not for anything in particular. Just listening. He found a fallen log near the shoreline and sat down slowly, the wood cool beneath him. From here, the lake filled his vision, framed by dark pines and pale sky. As the fog thinned, shapes emerged and then dissolved again, never staying long enough to be named. In those shifting forms lived the things Ethan had spent years outrunning. Faces without voices, rooms without doors, decisions made under pressure that had never come with apologies attached. They did not arrive all at once. They never did. They drifted in quietly, the way fog returns when you think it is gone for good. This was why he had come. Not to be forgiven, not to explain himself to anyone, living or dead, only to listen. The lake seemed to absorb his attention without reacting. Its surface remained smooth, unbroken, indifferent to the man sitting on its edge. Somewhere behind him, Hunter paused his slow circuit and lifted his head. His ears angled forward, sharp now, no longer relaxed. Ethan noticed the change not because the dog made a sound, but because he didn't. The air shifted in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. A ripple cut across the water, narrow and precise, too intentional to be wind. It traveled several feet before dissolving back into stillness, leaving no trace behind. Ethan leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, eyes narrowed. He had seen water move before. He knew the difference between chance and purpose. Hunter's body stiffened, muscles bunching beneath his coat, his gaze fixed on the far tree line across the lake. For a brief moment, everything held. The trees. The water, the man, the dog. Then, from somewhere deep within the forest came a subtle sound, not a snap, not a crash, just the suggestion of weight shifting, of something alive adjusting its stance. It was the kind of sound that meant very little to most people, and everything to those who had learned how danger often announced itself. Hunter did not growl. He did not bark. He simply stepped closer to Ethan, placing his body slightly forward, a quiet line drawn in the dirt. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him in a controlled stream. He did not reach for anything. He did not stand. There was no need. Whatever had moved out there knew now that it was not alone, just as Ethan knew he was no longer entirely by himself either. The lake returned to its perfect stillness, the ripple forgotten, as if it had never been there at all. Silence settled again, but it had changed. It was no longer just absence. It felt aware, watchful, like a presence that had noticed being noticed. Ethan rested his hands on his thighs and let his shoulders drop a fraction, a small release he did not consciously decide to allow. He stayed seated, eyes on the water, Hunter steady at his side, both of them listening to what was not being said. The day continued to brighten, slowly and without ceremony. Light filtered through the pines at a low angle, catching on needles and damp bark, turning ordinary things briefly luminous. The lake accepted the light without reflecting it back, holding it instead deep and unreadable. Ethan did not expect answers to rise from its surface. He had lived long enough to know that answers rarely arrived in recognizable forms. What he did know, with a certainty that settled deep in his chest, was this: the quiet here was not empty. It carried memory. It carried patience. It carried the accumulated weight of all the moments that had passed through this place and left something behind. Whether those moments were kind or cruel no longer mattered. They had been held all the same. Hunter finally relaxed, lowering himself to the ground, though his eyes never fully left the tree line. Ethan remained where he was, the cold seeping slowly through his jeans, the smell of pine thick in the air. He had not come here to escape anything. He had come because, for the first time in a long while, he was ready to stay. And the lake, silent as it was, seemed to understand that better than anyone ever had. Morning arrived without color. It did not brighten the lake so much as thin it, draining the night into a palette of pale grays that felt borrowed from another decade. The sky hovered low, undecided, and the water reflected it without comment, smooth and flat like an old photograph left too long beneath glass. The air carried a cold dampness that clung to the skin, and the smell of wet earth rose quietly from the shoreline, heavy and familiar. Hunter moved before Ethan noticed the shift. There was no sudden burst of energy, no sound to announce it. The German shepherd simply angled his body forward and began to follow a line only he could see, nose lowered, shoulders rolling with a slow, deliberate rhythm. He was not running. He was reading. Each step was measured, respectful, as though the ground itself were speaking and he did not want to interrupt. Ethan followed a few paces behind, boots pressing into soft mud that yielded and held, leaving shallow impressions that filled with dark water almost immediately. His heart rate stayed even, the way it had learned to do when surprise no longer carried novelty. Fear did not rush him anymore. It had changed its habits over the years. Now it arrived quietly, settled in beside him like an acquaintance who no longer needed introductions. The shoreline curved gently ahead, reeds growing thicker where the lake bent inward, their stalks whispering faintly as Hunter passed. The dog slowed further, nose tracing the edge where water met land, where mud recorded details longer than memory ever could. Ethan crouched briefly and saw them too then. The prints were deep. Rounded, pressed into the earth with undeniable authority. Whatever had made them carried weight and confidence in equal measure. Bear. The word did not echo in his mind. It did not need to. It simply settled there, accepted without argument. Ethan straightened and continued on, his gaze scanning the tree line across the water, the spaces between trunks where light struggled to pass. The forest stood still, neither inviting nor hostile, just present. Moral dissonance crept in quietly, the old tension between what people imagined danger to look like and the way it often truly appeared. No roaring, no drama, just signs left behind, patient and indifferent. Hunter stopped near a bend in the reeds. His body went rigid, muscles defined beneath his dark coat, ears forward but not flattened. Ethan stepped closer and followed the line of the dog's attention down to the water. That was when he saw it. A wooden boat rested half-pulled onto the shore, its hull scarred and weathered, one side darkened by years of contact with water. It sat at an angle that suggested intention, not accident, as if someone had taken the time to leave it that way. The boat was old, not antique, but seasoned. Its surface bore the marks of repeated use, shallow grooves where ropes had once rubbed, faint dents where it had been guided into place again and again. One oar was missing. The other lay inside, worn smooth along the handle, the wood polished by hands that knew its shape well. This was not something a weekend tourist abandoned without thought. It was also not something the lake had claimed on its own. Ethan knelt beside it, careful not to disturb more than necessary. His fingers brushed the hull, feeling the texture of the grain beneath years of weather. There were places where the wood had been sanded down by use, not erosion. Human use, repetition, care. The realization settled slowly, carrying weight far beyond the object itself. Someone had crossed this lake many times, recently enough that the boat still waited. Hunter lifted his head and stared across the water toward the opposite shore. A low sound formed in his chest, controlled and restrained, never allowed to become a growl. It was a warning held back by discipline, the kind that came not from fear, but from recognition. Ethan rose to his feet and followed the dog's gaze. The far shore looked no different from this one. Pines, shadow, fog lingering just enough to blur detail. And yet, something about it felt attentive. In that moment, Ethan sensed it, not the feeling of being hunted, not even watched. It was subtler than that. He felt acknowledged, as if the lake itself had registered his presence and adjusted accordingly. The water remained still, offering no reflection sharp enough to read, but the air carried a faint pressure, a sense of awareness that had nothing to do with sound or sight. It was the same sensation he had felt years ago in unfamiliar rooms, when decisions had already been made before he entered. He straightened slowly, shoulders squared, breath steady. There was no need to speak. Whatever had left the boat here did not require words. The contact had already been made. Not with a person, not yet, but with evidence of a life lived quietly alongside this place. A life that had learned the rhythms of the lake well enough to move across it without leaving chaos behind. The rest of the day unfolded differently after that. Ethan returned to camp with Hunter close at his side, the image of the boat never far from his thoughts. The lake no longer felt empty. It felt occupied in ways that did not announce themselves. The fog lifted further as afternoon approached, revealing more of the water's surface, though its depth remained unreadable. Light touched the tops of the pines and slid down their trunks without ever fully reaching the ground. Ethan gathered wood methodically, stacking it closer to the fire ring than he had planned the night before. Each piece was chosen with care, tested for dryness, placed within easy reach. Hunter watched from a short distance away. Posture relaxed but attention unbroken, eyes flicking occasionally toward the far shore. The dog did not return to the water's edge. He did not need to. He had already said what he needed to say. As evening approached, the temperature dropped quickly. The lake darkened into a sheet of dull steel, reflecting nothing of the sky now that the light had faded. Ethan lit the fire earlier than usual, coaxing the flames until they caught and held. He pulled the ring closer to the tent, reducing the space between light and shelter. Not for warmth. The cold was manageable. This was about something else entirely. Darkness gathered in layers. The forest absorbed it easily, the way it always had. Ethan fed the fire slowly, listening to the crackle of burning wood, the small explosions of sap releasing themselves. Each sound felt amplified in the quiet, each movement deliberate. Hunter settled near the edge of the light, his silhouette sharp against the glow, eyes reflecting amber when he turned his head. Across the lake, the far shore remained indistinct, a line of shadow against shadow. Ethan found himself watching it more than the fire, his attention drawn outward, pulled by questions that had not yet formed words. The boat, the missing oar, the care taken to leave it. None of it fit the simple explanations people preferred, and that, more than anything, unsettled him. When the fire burned steadily, Ethan dragged a few more logs closer still, stacking them within arm's reach. He paused, then adjusted their position again, creating a small wall of wood that would last through the night. The gesture was quiet, almost instinctive. But it marked a change. He was no longer just camping beside a lake, he was staying awake with it. The water remained silent, unbroken, holding its secrets without apology. Ethan sat back on his heels for a moment, eyes on the flames, then on the darkness beyond. Whatever waited across that lake had made itself known without stepping forward. That was enough for now. Contact did not always arrive with faces or voices. Sometimes it came as proof. Sometimes it came as an object left behind, patient and certain. As night settled fully, Ethan rose and pulled the fire closer still, tightening the circle of light until it felt intentional. The lake accepted the glow without reflecting it back. Hunter remained still, alert but calm, his presence steady and grounding. Nothing else moved. Nothing needed to. The first contact had already done its work. Darkness fell fast, heavier than Ethan expected. It did not slide in gently from the edges of the forest, but dropped all at once, as if someone had lowered a curtain without warning. The lake lost what little reflection it had been holding, turning into a wide, featureless void that swallowed light rather than returning it. The air cooled sharply, and with it came a damp stillness that pressed against the skin and settled deep into the chest. The fire became the center of everything. Ethan adjusted it with deliberate care, feeding it one branch at a time, listening for the change in pitch that told him the flame had accepted the offering. He chose each piece of wood slowly, testing its weight, its dryness, the way it would burn. There was a familiar rhythm in this, one he had learned long ago in places where fire meant the difference between being found and being forgotten. He treated it the way one treats a fragile promise, aware that neglect, even briefly, could cost more than comfort. Hunter did not lie down. The German shepherd remained on his feet near the edge of the firelight, body angled outward, ears alert but controlled. His breathing stayed steady, shallow enough not to echo in the quiet. From time to time, he shifted his weight, paws pressing silently into the dirt, marking his presence without challenging anything beyond the light. He had chosen his role for the night, and it did not involve sleep. The forest absorbed the darkness easily. Sounds that had been scattered during the day now felt closer, tighter, as if distance itself had shortened. A branch creaked somewhere far off, then another answered closer by. The lake remained unnaturally still, its surface hidden but felt, like something watching with its eyes closed. Ethan stayed seated on a low stool beside the fire, shoulders relaxed but posture ready, attention split between the flames and the dark beyond them. The first sound came well after midnight. It was not loud enough to startle, not sharp enough to demand immediate action. Just a breath. Low, wet, close. It carried weight with it, the kind that suggested size and patience rather than speed. Hunter froze, every muscle in his frame tightening at once, his head lifting a fraction as his ears locked onto the source. The bear did not rush. It did not charge or roar or announce itself in the ways stories preferred to tell. It moved slowly, deliberately. circling the clearing just beyond the reach of the firelight. Ethan rose to his feet in one smooth motion, the stool left behind without a sound. One hand came to rest on the flare gun clipped near his belt, fingers familiar with its shape. The other settled on Hunter's neck, not gripping, not restraining, just present. Trust moved both ways, quiet and complete. The fire crackled, sending sparks upward in a sudden burst. They rose like startled birds before vanishing into the dark, briefly illuminating the outline of trees and the uneven ground at the clearing's edge. For a moment, a shape passed through that brief glow. Massive, broad, patient. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind the unmistakable impression of presence. Hunter stepped forward, not fast, not aggressive. Just enough to shorten the distance between himself and whatever waited beyond the light. He did not bark. He did not growl. He held his ground, body squared, head high, a living line drawn in the dirt. Ethan stayed with him, shoulders squared, breath controlled, aware of every sound his own body made. Time stretched thin. Seconds lost their meaning, then minutes followed. The night seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting to see which of them would move first. Ethan felt the familiar hum of fatigue creeping in, not physical yet, but mental, the kind that arrived after too many hours of vigilance layered on too many memories. Moral dissonance settled in quietly, the contrast between what people imagined survival to look like and what it truly required. There was no heroism here, no triumph, only endurance. The bear continued its slow circle, never stepping fully into the firelight, never retreating far enough to disappear entirely. Its presence was constant, measured, as if it were testing the boundaries rather than challenging them. Hunter's stance did not change. He remained still, unblinking, his loyalty expressed not through motion but restraint. Ethan adjusted his footing once, careful not to break the rhythm they had established. At last, the shadow shifted direction. The heavy breathing softened, moving farther away, though not enough to suggest departure. The bear retreated into the trees but did not leave the area. Its footsteps faded, then stopped. The forest resumed its quiet, but it was a different quiet now, one layered with awareness and unfinished intention. Ethan did not lower his hand from the flare gun. He did not sit back down. He stayed on his feet through the night, feeding the fire whenever the flames dipped too low. Each branch he added brought a brief surge of light, then settled into a steady glow. His movements remained careful, economical, shaped by long practice in nights that demanded alertness without drama. This was not the kind of night that would ever make headlines. It was the kind that passed unnoticed, carried only by those who endured it. Hunter remained awake as well, though his posture softened slightly as the hours wore on. He shifted closer to the fire, then back again, maintaining the balance between warmth and watchfulness. Once, near the deepest part of the night, he glanced up at Ethan, eyes reflecting the firelight with quiet certainty. No words were exchanged. None were needed. As the sky began to lighten, almost imperceptibly, the tension eased without fully releasing. The forest did not change its stance, but the darkness thinned enough to allow shapes to separate again. Ethan felt the fatigue then, settling into his arms and hands, a dull ache that spread slowly rather than all at once. His fingers trembled slightly as he placed another log onto the fire, not from fear, but from the accumulated weight of staying awake, of staying present. This exhaustion was familiar. He had carried it before through nights that never made the news, through hours that demanded attention without offering recognition. It was the cost of vigilance, paid quietly and without complaint. As the first true light touched the tops of the pines, Ethan allowed himself to breathe a little deeper, shoulders dropping just enough to acknowledge the passage of time. Across the lake, the fog shifted. It parted briefly, just long enough to reveal a glint of something solid on the far shore. The light caught it at an angle, sharp and unmistakable. Not stone, not water, something shaped by human hands. The fog closed again almost immediately, as if embarrassed by the disclosure, leaving Ethan staring across the water with a new awareness settling into his chest. The night had passed, but it had not ended the conversation. It had only clarified it. Whatever waited beyond that lake had endured nights like this before, and now it had been seen. Ethan pushed the boat into the water just after morning settled enough to be called a morning. The lake had not changed its expression overnight, but the light lay differently on its surface now, thinner, more deliberate, as if revealing only what it was willing to share. The oar entered the water without sound, cutting through the gray reflection with practiced restraint. Hunter lay steady at the bow, weight balanced, eyes fixed forward, his posture carrying the quiet confidence of something that had done this before. Perhaps not here, perhaps not now, but somewhere memory still lived. Each stroke moved them farther from the familiar shoreline and closer to the far bank that had refused detail from a distance. Fog drifted low over the water, parting slowly around the boat and closing again behind it, leaving no trace of passage. Ethan kept his movements economical, wrists loose, shoulders relaxed, careful not to disturb the surface more than necessary. The lake accepted them without resistance, but it did not guide them either. It simply allowed the crossing. The opposite shore rose gently, darker than it had appeared the night before. As the boat scraped softly against damp earth, Ethan stepped out and steadied it with one hand, feeling the cold seep immediately through his boots. Hunter followed, landing without sound, body low but calm, ears lifting as he took in the new ground. The forest here felt older somehow, the air thicker, layered with scents that had not been carried across the water. Something about it suggested continuity rather than abandonment. The cabin stood just beyond the tree line, low, crooked, leaning slightly to one side, as if it had learned to live with imbalance rather than fight it. Its wood was darkened by time and weather, but the structure held, each plank still doing the work it had been asked to do years ago. There was no sense of collapse here, no violence in its aging. It looked, instead, like something still breathing, quietly and without announcement. Ethan approached slowly, each step deliberate, aware of how sound traveled in places like this. The door opened with a soft protest, hinges stiff but intact. Inside, the air was cool and dry, carrying the faint smell of old wood, iron, and smoke long since settled into the walls. Dust lay undisturbed on most surfaces, holding shape rather than chaos, as though nothing had happened here suddenly. Tools hung where hands would expect them to be, arranged with care rather than convenience. This was not a place that had been left behind. It was a place that had been paused. Light filtered through a small window, catching on suspended dust motes that drifted lazily and then settled again. A narrow cot stood against one wall, blanket folded neatly at its foot. On a shelf nearby sat a tin cup, a knife sharpened thin with use, and a coil of rope that had been rewound carefully, not discarded. Each object carried the quiet authority of routine. Whoever lived here had not been hiding. They had been living. At the center of the small table rested a notebook. Leather-bound, its edges worn smooth, the pages warped slightly by years of handling. Ethan did not reach for it immediately. He stood there instead, aware of the weight it carried without touching it, the way one senses gravity before stepping too close. Hunter remained near the doorway, body angled outward, listening to the forest beyond, guarding without display. When Ethan finally lifted the notebook, it felt heavier than it should have, not in mass but in meaning. He opened it slowly, careful not to force the spine. The writing inside was sparse, practical, almost austere. Dates marked the passing of time, notes on weather, on tracks seen near the water, on fish taken and meals missed. Hunger appeared more than once, never dramatized, simply recorded. Pain, when mentioned at all, was reduced to function. Then, between those entries, came sentences that cut clean through the page. The lake listens. I stayed because leaving was louder. Ethan paused, fingers resting against the margin. The words did not ask for understanding. They did not explain themselves. They simply existed. Precise and unadorned, carrying a truth that required no witness. The handwriting suggested a steady hand, someone who wrote only what needed to be written and nothing more. This was not the voice of someone running away. It was the voice of someone who had chosen stillness as an act of survival. He read on, piecing together a life measured in seasons rather than years. Solitude, yes, but not despair. Routine shaped by light and weather, by the lake's moods and the forest's tolerance. The entries grew farther apart near the end, the ink slightly uneven, the lines shorter. The final page held only a date and the beginning of a sentence that never found its ending. Ethan closed the notebook gently. Whatever had interrupted this life had not erased it. The absence of a conclusion felt intentional, as if the story had simply stepped out of view rather than ceased. Moral dissonance settled quietly in his chest, the tension between what people imagined solitude to be and what it could become when chosen rather than imposed. This man had not been forgotten. He had been sustained. Outside, Hunter shifted, his head lifted sharply, ears fully upright now, body tightening without sound. The change was immediate and unmistakable. Ethan moved to the doorway and followed the dog's gaze toward the tree line. The forest had changed its posture, subtle but real. The air felt denser, the silence more deliberate, a presence pressed against the edge of perception. The bear had returned. It did not announce itself. There was no crash of branches, no threat displayed. The sense of it came first, heavy and patient, followed by a low sound that might have been breath or might have been the forest itself adjusting. Hunter stepped forward half a pace, weight centered, muscles ready but restrained. He did not bark. He did not growl. He waited. Ethan stood still, the notebook held close against his chest, aware now of how these moments overlapped. The man who had lived here, the bear that circled but did not attack, the lake that listened without responding, none of it felt accidental. The bear was not here for food. Its posture did not carry hunger, it carried attention. It was waiting. Ethan did not step outside. He did not retreat either. The cabin held its breath along with him, walls absorbing the tension without complaint. In that suspended moment, he understood something without language. This place had rules older than fear. It allowed presence, but not intrusion. It tested, but it did not punish without cause. The bear remained just beyond sight, close enough to be known, distant enough to remain unseen. Hunter's eyes stayed fixed, his body steady, loyalty expressed through restraint rather than challenge. Ethan lowered the notebook slowly and set it back on the table, exactly where he had found it. Some things were not meant to be carried away. Some discoveries asked only to be witnessed. The light shifted outside, clouds moving across the sun, and the pressure eased slightly. The forest exhaled. Whatever had been waiting did not leave, but it settled, as if satisfied for now. Ethan remained where he was, heart steady, mind quiet, the meaning of what he had found unfolding slowly rather than all at once. The crossing had brought him more than answers. It had brought context. That night, Ethan rebuilt the fire on the far shore as the last light drained from the sky. He made it larger than before, stacking the wood with care, leaving space for air to move and flame to breathe. The fire answered him willingly, climbing higher, brighter, until its glow pressed back the dark and claimed a circle of ground as its own. The lake accepted the light without reflecting it cleanly, breaking it instead into scattered fragments that trembled and disappeared. Hunter settled nearby, close enough to feel the warmth, but far enough to keep the forest in view. His body was relaxed in posture, yet alert in intention, ears occasionally lifting, eyes steady, his presence anchoring the moment. Ethan stood for a while without sitting, hands resting loosely at his sides, letting the heat reach him slowly. The air smelled of resin and old smoke, familiar and grounding, a scent that carried him back to other nights where fire had been the only certainty. The bear appeared at the edge of the trees just as the fire reached its strongest burn. It did not step forward, it did not retreat, it stood where shadow and light met, its massive shape defined by the contrast rather than movement. The forest seemed to lean toward it, branches and trunks forming a quiet corridor, as if acknowledging a presence that had always belonged. Ethan did not reach for anything. He straightened, shoulders settling into a posture that felt less like defense and more like recognition. His voice, when it came, was low and even, carried by the fire rather than pushed toward the trees. "Go on." The words were not a command, they were an offering, spoken as much to himself as to the animal that listened without blinking. The bear did not move at first. It remained still, head angled slightly, breath visible in the shifting light. The moment stretched, not with threat but with consideration, as if something ancient were weighing the terms of an unspoken agreement. Then, slowly, the bear turned away. Its bulk slipped back into the forest, absorbed by shadow without sound, leaving the edge of the clearing empty once more. Ethan exhaled, not sharply, not with relief, but with release. The fire settled into a steady rhythm, flames lowering just enough to be companionable rather than commanding. In the quiet that followed, a realization began to take shape, not as a sudden revelation, but as a truth that had been waiting for language. He was not the first man to arrive here broken. He was not the first to fear the sound of his own thoughts when there was nothing left to drown them out. And he would not be the last. The notebook lay open beside him on the ground, its pages held down by a smooth stone he had picked up without thinking. The firelight danced across the ink, softening its edges, giving the words a gentler presence than they had held inside the cabin. Ethan had not noticed the final line before. It sat there quietly, written in a different hand, the ink older, faded just enough to suggest time had passed between one thought and the next. If you found this, you stayed long enough. Ethan read the sentence once, then again, letting it settle. The meaning reached deeper than instruction or praise. It carried permission. It acknowledged endurance rather than achievement, patience rather than courage. Staying, it suggested, was not a failure of movement, but an act of trust. Hunter rose and stepped closer, placing his head against the toe of Ethan's boot. The contact was simple, unremarkable, and yet it loosened something that had been held tight for years, not the pain itself. That remained, familiar and shaped by time. What loosened was the grip around it, the constant pressure to outrun, to silence, to justify. Ethan rested a hand on the dog's neck, fingers sinking into warm fur, the steady rise and fall of Hunter's breathing, reminding him that presence could be shared without explanation. Across the lake, the water caught the firelight and broke it apart into countless small reflections, like stars scattered and imperfect. They shimmered briefly, then vanished, replaced by new ones as the flames shifted. The lake did not speak. It did not offer clarity or closure, but it responded in its own way, holding the light just long enough to be seen, then letting it go. Ethan sat down slowly, knees stiff, muscles tired in a way that felt earned rather than depleted. He stared into the fire, watching patterns form and dissolve, each one complete only for a moment. He thought of the man who had lived here before him, of the choice to remain, to listen, to let the noise of leaving pass without following it. That choice had not erased suffering. It had simply given it room to breathe. Moral dissonance surfaced gently, the contrast between what Ethan had been taught to value and what he was learning to accept. Strength, he had been told, was movement, action, progress measured by distance traveled. Yet here, strength revealed itself as stillness, as the willingness to stay present when nothing demanded performance. The forest seemed to understand this better than people ever had. It offered no applause, only continuity. The night deepened, but it no longer pressed in the same way. The fire's warmth reached beyond the skin, settling into joints and memory alike. Hunter lay down at Ethan's feet, head resting comfortably, eyes half-lidded but attentive. The bond between them required no ceremony. It existed in shared vigilance, in trust earned quietly and renewed each day without announcement. Ethan picked up the notebook once more, not to read but to feel its weight again. He closed it carefully and set it beside him, letting it be part of the circle rather than an object apart. Some stories, he understood now, were not meant to be finished in the traditional sense. They were meant to be continued by presence rather than pages. The silence answered back, not with sound but with space. It allowed the fire to crackle, the dog to breathe, the lake to hold and release light. It allowed Ethan to sit with himself without flinching. In that allowance, something settled, not as peace exactly, but as acceptance. The night did not demand anything more. When he finally lay back and looked up at the sky, clouds drifted slowly across the stars, revealing and hiding them in equal measure. The world did not promise permanence. It never had. What it offered instead was the chance to remain long enough to be changed by what stayed. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough. Dawn arrived without ceremony. It did not announce itself with color or warmth, only a gradual thinning of night that made shapes possible again. Ethan was already awake, hands moving with quiet purpose, breath steady in the cool air. He knelt beside the boat where it rested on damp earth, tightening joints that had loosened with time, testing each seam until the wood answered with firmness rather than complaint. A new oar lay beside him, pale against the darker grain, shaped simply and honestly, made not for speed, but for continuity. He worked without hurry, not because there was nothing left to fear, but because fear no longer dictated the pace. Each adjustment felt like a conversation with the craft itself, an understanding reached through patience rather than force. This was not preparation for escape. It was preparation for going on. Hunter watched from a short distance away, seated and calm, his posture balanced, eyes following Ethan's movements with quiet trust. When the boat slid into the water, it did so without protest. The lake accepted it as it had before, the surface parting gently around the hull and closing again behind it. Ethan stepped in, distributing his weight carefully, and Hunter followed, settling beside him with practiced ease. The fog lifted in slow bands as they moved forward, opening a path just wide enough to pass through, then folding back into itself, leaving no sign they had ever been there. The crossing felt different this time, not lighter, not easier, but clearer. Each stroke of the oar entered the water cleanly and left it without sound, the rhythm steady and unforced. Ethan's shoulders relaxed as the shoreline receded, the far bank drawing closer with a familiarity that had not existed before. The lake did not guide them, it did not resist them, it simply allowed the movement to happen. The cabin came into view through thinning mist, unchanged, yet newly understood. It stood as it always had, low and slightly uneven, its quiet persistence now less mysterious than respectful. Ethan guided the boat ashore and stepped out, boots sinking briefly before finding firm ground. Hunter followed, shaking off water with a quick, contained motion, then pausing to take in the forest one last time. Inside the cabin, the air held its steady calm. Light filtered through the window at a shallow angle, illuminating dust that drifted and settled as if following rules of its own. Ethan crossed to the table and placed the notebook exactly where he had found it, leather cover facing up, pages protected from damp and time. He opened it carefully, the familiar weight settling into his hands once more. He added a single entry. I listened. That was enough. The words did not seek permanence. They did not claim resolution. They simply marked presence, a moment acknowledged and released. Ethan closed the notebook and rested his hand on it for a breath longer than necessary, then stepped back. Some endings did not require ceremony. Some truths did not need to be carried forward to remain true. Outside, the morning had fully taken shape. Light moved through the trees, catching on needles and bark, turning ordinary surfaces briefly luminous. Ethan stood beside the cabin for a moment, taking in the scene without trying to capture it. Hunter came to his side, close enough to feel, not touching, simply there. The bond between them needed no reinforcement. It had been proven quietly, night by night. They returned to the boat without looking back more than once. The lake received them again, smooth and unreadable, its surface reflecting the sky only in fragments. As Ethan paddled, three understandings settled into him with a clarity that felt earned rather than discovered. The first was simple and difficult at once. Staying was not the same as surrender. He had learned that endurance did not require movement, only honesty. To remain present when the noise fell away was an act of courage few recognized and fewer still practiced. The second followed closely behind. Silence was not absence. It was a medium, a space where truths could exist without being forced into shape, where answers arrived not as declarations, but as allowances. The third came last and stayed longest. He understood now that permission did not always come from others. Sometimes it arrived through experience, through patience, through the quiet acknowledgement that one had done enough simply by listening. This permission did not erase pain. It made room for it, transforming pressure into presence. The far shore approached, familiar now, no longer defined by uncertainty. Ethan guided the boat in with the same care he had shown all morning, letting it rest where it belonged. He stepped out, helped Hunter ashore, and stood there for a moment as the fog thinned and lifted entirely. The lake lay behind them, unchanged, unmarked, complete in its refusal to comment. They left the campsite as they had found it. The ground showed little evidence of their passing. The fire pit lay cold, ash settled, stones undisturbed. Ethan took one last look at the water, not in farewell, but in acknowledgement. Some places did not need goodbye. They remained whether you stayed or left, holding what they held without demand. As they walked back toward the truck, the forest shifted subtly, a breeze moving through branches high above, carrying the faint sound of something distant and unfamiliar. It was not threatening. It was not inviting. It was simply there, a reminder that paths did not end so much as open into others. Ethan paused briefly, listening, then continued on. The engine started on the first turn. Its sound felt louder than before, not because the world had changed, but because he had. As the truck pulled away, the lake slipped from view behind the trees, its presence lingering without attachment. Ethan drove on, Hunter resting calmly in the passenger seat, the road unfolding ahead without urgency. He carried something with him now, though it was not peace in the way people often imagined it. It was permission. Permission to stay with himself when the noise returned. Permission to trust quiet as a companion rather than a threat. Permission to believe that unseen hands, human or divine, left traces of light for those willing to wait long enough to notice them. The lake did not say goodbye. It did not need to. I left the lake the way I arrived, quietly, but I did not leave it unchanged within me. The road carried me forward, yet something in my chest had slowed, as if it had finally learned a different rhythm. The day did not feel conquered or completed. It felt listened to. In that listening, the sharp edges of my thoughts softened, and the weight I had carried for years loosened just enough to breathe. What this place taught me was not bravery in the way stories usually define it. It taught me that staying can be an act of courage, that stillness can hold more truth than motion, and that silence is not a void to be feared, but a language waiting to be understood. I learned that pain does not always ask to be fixed. Sometimes it only asks to be given space, to be witnessed without judgment. And in giving it that space, something gentler grows beside it. Nature did not offer me answers in words. It offered patterns, light breaking on water, fog lifting when it was ready, fire holding through the night because it was tended with care. Beside me, my dog understood this instinctively, teaching me again what trust looks like when it is quiet and unwavering. Together, we learned that survival is not only about enduring the wild, but about letting the wild remind you who you were before the noise began. I am not healed in the way people imagine healing to be, but I am changed. I carry permission now, the permission to stay with myself when the world grows loud, to trust the pauses between moments, and to believe that unseen kindness moves through our lives more often than we notice. The lake did not ask me to return, nor did it ask me to stay away. It simply remained, holding its light and its silence, and as I drove on, I understood that some journeys end not with answers, but with a readiness to listen again, somewhere else, some morning yet to come.